Welcome to the Wipro's webinar. We try to do this on a monthly basis and bring topics that are relevant for regulatory professionals. And today we have the honor of having Dr. Umo Jodrieski I hope with us, who is the head the global regulatory policy and intelligence at Moderna. Um, is going to give a background about his professional journey, but briefly, I know him as a very energetic scientist and now a regulatory expert. He worked at the agency. He has worked at multiple pharmaceutical companies, which gives him a unique perspective in terms of pre-IND meetings. And we asked him to name five do's and don'ts to start a discussion, set a background, and hopefully you all will chime in with your views and comments, and then we can have a lively discussion. Without further ado, I would like to say that today's webinar is being recorded, and please feel free to comment or post questions in the chat box, and I will try to triage the questions for a discussion. And Timo, I'm going to turn it to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Yoga, first for the invitation and also for the very kind introduction. It's good to see you again virtually. Yoga and I have worked together for a good period of time at the agency. I just wanted to mention the disclaimer real quick, that the views and opinions expressed during these presentations are strictly my own and do not necessarily represent those of Moderna. And with that, you might probably ask, how do you get into policy, or how did I get into policy and reg intelligence? So you can see on this slide a little bit of my journey into the policy world. I started out as a pharmacist in 2001 in Germany and came for an internship to the US at the University of Florida, and subsequently came back for graduate school and received my PhD from the University of Florida. My thought was always, what the understanding in Germany is as a core work of pharmacists to go into formulation, but then the track from Florida actually took me to the agency, and I was at the FDA about 8 years, from 2008 to 2016. I was a clinical pharmacology reviewer in metabolism endocrine, and then a team lead for another 3.5 years, and then joined professional affairs and stakeholder engagement. And just to give you some numbers about what you see as a reviewer at the FDA, I worked on over 250 individual INDs, so that's separate compounds, not just different protocols. A lot of pre-IND meetings for a lot of those compounds, and about 90 NDAs, and 13 of those were new molecular entities, most of which went to an advisory committee meeting. So there's a lot of experience there to be gathered, looking over this wide range of compounds, different indications, different questions asked in different meetings at FDA. After my public service, I thought it was time for a change, and I left the FDA, and going from the technical part in Clin Pharm to the professional affairs and stakeholder engagement, and working with professional association, patient advocacy group, patient-focused drug development. So all this made me think about how to work on the policy landscape, right? To see what we can do for patients from the outside. So I joined EMD Serono in 2016. I was the US head for policy and reg intel there. Loved my time at EMD Serono. And then the opportunity came up in 2021 during the pandemic to actually join Moderna. And I've been there since June 2021, almost 2 years, heading the global policy and reg intel group. It's a fascinating field and very, very dynamic, very collaborative. So I really am enjoying my time there. So having talked about the vast number of INDs that individual reviewers or team leaders might see, I wanted to give you a quick overview of what is a pre-IND, why does it matter? So FDA actually sees the pre-IND as part of the IND stage of the drug development process. So it doesn't just start at the IND until the submission. They actually view it as an integral part of the drug development process. So that phase includes, drug discovery, early workup of compounds, and even clinical trials conducted outside of a US IND. It happens, I've seen it multiple times that companies came with an IND that had a full clinical trial package already. And there are a lot of benefits to a pre-IND meeting for sponsors. An early interaction with FDA, it can help you identify studies that support the initiation of your clinical trials when you submit your IND and your first in-human study, if there were no clinical trials conducted outside the US. These discussions with FDA can help you potentially minimize any potential for clinical holds. We have some early on discussions, get some feedback from FDA, maybe go back to make some changes or do some additional analysis or do some additional studies. It will really help you with some early strategic development planning. So for example, what methods are there available to enhance your development over the course of the whole development process? It helps a little bit with efficient resource managing, both for sponsors. So with the strategic planning, obviously comes some resource management. So it helps sponsors understand what FDA's needs are, what they might be looking for, where there might be some roadblocks or bottlenecks or some deficiencies potentially in the preclinical package enabling first in human study. But it also helps to manage resources for FDA so they understand and can give some feedback. So later on, there is no need for reviewing data that might be deficient. It enables the sponsor to discuss some unique challenges that you might have in your development program. Is there a guideline already available for what you're doing? Are you trying to do something completely different? Are you thinking outside of the box or something that's maybe a new technology? So it helps you get some discussion and some feedback on these unique challenges. And there is another process where you actually earlier, even before the pre-IND, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit too, because I thought it was a part that would help sponsors, the interact meetings. There you actually have a much earlier interaction with FDA, even before the pre-IND, to discuss some preliminary preclinical proof of concept studies, what might need to be done, and get some very early feedback from FDA to then prepare for your pre-IND and IND. So how do you evaluate whether you want to do a pre-IND meeting and the questions that you have? So I tried to put together a little bit of a landscape for you as a reference or understanding of what is out there in terms of guidance for pre-IND meetings. And it's not just guidance. So a lot of sponsors think, well, there's an FDA guidance for a particular part, but there's also to help you understand how the internals of the FDA work, what their decision timing might be internally. There is some standard operating policies and procedures, the SOPPs, and also the internal manual of policies and procedures that are all available on the FDA website, where it goes a little bit into the internal processes and how the good review practices work, who interacts with whom during the review process. So here is an overview of guidelines. The FDA Pre-IND rare disease meeting guidance, the general guidance for meeting or formal meetings with FDA. There is a CBER standard operating procedure and a map for IND development. So take a look at the whole landscape when you're planning this meeting to really give you an insight into what the agency is looking for and how they work internally. It helps both. It helps the FDA and the sponsor to understand the process. So what are some meeting topics? And there have been some recent changes since last year from PDUFA 7. So I know it's a very text-heavy slide. I don't want to get over all the text. I wanted to make some quick points. So the Interact meeting usually happens before a pre-IND meeting. It was a meeting that was purely a CBER meeting before. And since PDUFA 7, now that opportunity to interact early before a pre-IND is also available at CDER. So that's one of the changes in PDUFA 7. Those Interact meetings are intended for more novel questions and very unique challenges in drug development. Some examples might be design of IND-enabling tox studies. If you have a new complex manufacturing technology or process, if you have an innovative device used with a drug or biologic, those are kind of the things you might want to discuss at an Interact meeting. The timelines are slightly longer than the pre-IND, so it's scheduling 75 calendar days from the receipt. The important part is here that the background package is due at the meeting request, compared to the pre-IND, where the background package is due 30 calendars before the scheduled date of the meeting for written response. Now, both of those meetings could be face-to-face, which might be some changes, a little bit more difficult after the pandemic, going back face-to-face still. But FDA can also provide written response. Now, there is a change in PDUFA 7 too, that now in PDUFA 7, you have the opportunity to ask clarifying questions. So if you have a written response, you have asked your questions, you see FDA response, and you wonder, what do they really mean? Or you need some clarification on that. You actually have the opportunity with timelines now to submit clarifying questions to the agency with the caveat, it's really just a clarification to the questions that you already posed and answers that FDA has provided. So you cannot provide new data or submit additional questions. You can send this within 20 days after receiving the meeting minutes, and FDA will issue a response within 20 calendar days of receipt. Now, this is in the PDUFA goals letter, and FDA is supposed to update the meeting guidance by end of September this year. So these procedures and new timelines are included in the guidance too. Now, finally, I think the part you have been waiting for since I've been talking, the 5 do and don'ts of pre-IND meetings. And I try to actually put the Interact part in here too. The do's are relatively similar. The don'ts might be slightly different. So both for Interact and pre-IND meetings, the first do is do your regulatory intelligence research. Look at precedent cases, previous approvals, either in the same class or for the same disease, right? Or for the technology you might want to use. Look at related cases, try to do some strategic analysis, right? Where some gaps have, what the approval packages a lot of times actually include the meeting communication that FDA publishes on the website. So you can take a look at what questions have been asked before in a particular disease area, or for a particular development program. What has FDA answered? So you can get a little bit of understanding of what they're looking for, and that might guide your thinking. And look at, like I mentioned, guidance documents, the standard operating policies and procedures, the maps, to give you a good idea of what you might want to ask. Plan to have the meeting at the right timing of the development program. This is more the difference between Interact and Pre-IND. Number 3 is ask an appropriate question for the development phase. So some questions, a lot of times we have seen answers that this question is premature, right? Because for that part of development phase, they were way too far ahead in asking the question. Very important, provide sufficient information to support your questions, or justify your position that you're making in your briefing document. And also provide a high-level overview of the clinical development program, so the agency understands of where you're going, what your plans are, and can maybe give a little bit of input what you might want to do. Now, the different don'ts. For Interact meeting, obviously the first one is don't forget to send the background package with a meeting request. Right? That's a requirement for this particular meeting. Submit a request for a program. Don't submit a request for a program that's too advanced for Interact. There's some clear criteria of when a meeting request might be denied because it's too advanced for an Interact meeting. When you're asking questions, don't focus on jurisdictions, whether which center or which regulatory pathway might use. This is more for Interact, more technical meeting to really give you an understanding of how your early development program should look like. Don't leave the reviewer guessing to provide constructive feedback on your package. So that goes together with provide the sufficient information and justification so they don't need to guess what your thinking is. And not be able to provide an adequate answer that might be constructive for you. And don't focus on the details of a specific clinical protocol at the Interact meeting. It's more a high-level overview of the development program to help the agency understand your overall thinking. The don'ts for the Pre-IND meeting. Don't request a meeting where the answers might be available in the guidances or in the some of the other documents, right? So do your research before, try to understand what the landscape looked like, and really try to focus on the questions that can't be answered yet or that cannot be found in previous approval packages. Especially in face-to-face meeting, don't spend too much time on your low priority questions going back and forth, but really focus on the questions that you want to answer most and where you have the most need for constructive feedback from FDA. One of the slightly difficult parts is don't ask unconnected multi-part questions, where the agency might answer one part but not the other part, right? And try to anticipate a question that might lead the agency to answer, this might be a review issue. So ask a question in a way whether, things might be acceptable for a certain part in the development program, and not, if we have this data, could we get this particular indication, for example? That might be a review issue, and it doesn't really help you then if you get this answer. Especially during a face-to-face meeting, do not present data that's not included in the meeting package. It's hard to provide constructive feedback, if the data hasn't been seen before by the reviewer. And last but not least, try not to focus so much on the late stages of development. That goes into the review issue question. For example, labeling questions regarding indication or phase 3 study design or data to obtain a particular indication. those might be questions for a later point that might be premature, maybe at the pre-IND stage. In the previous slide, I included the link to the different documents to make it a little easier for you to access them. And with that, I wanted to see what questions I can help you with based on either the do's and don'ts or the experience that I have. And please feel free to ask your questions. Oops, I think, Joga, you're mute. I can hear you at least.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Emo. It's for a very well articulated set of instructions or perspectives. I'm monitoring the chat for questions, but let's have a conversation. Meanwhile, as the group gets warmed up, I wanted to ask you at a very high level, would you recommend that pre-IND meetings be considered as a process meeting or a strategic meeting?
I would think it's a strategic meeting, right? Because it helps you plan really your resources. It helps you plan for your development program. It gives you some early feedback on what you're doing is what the agency is looking for. So you can then, if you have a regulatory strategy document, if you have a target product profile, right, it can really help inform what you already have in those documents and maybe change your development program to really address the agency's concerns, right? And really make an IND submission successful and potentially prevent a clinical hold. So I think it's a strategic meeting, really. It really helps inform the strategy. If you ask the right questions, right? Obviously, if you get answers or if you ask questions like I mentioned before, this might be a review issue or it depends. That makes it very difficult then for strategic planning. But if you ask the right questions to elicit really constructive feedback, then it becomes a highly strategic meeting.
Thank you. Yeah, I would agree with that as well.
I think one of the really most important parts is, and you have seen this too, is a lot of times I've seen, and when you go through the data now too, is this question is premature, right? It's really trying to focus the questions on the appropriate timing of the development. I think there's nothing, I don't know how to say, a little bit frustrating for the sponsor, right? If you ask, for both. So if you ask questions where the agency has to respond, this might be a review issue, or where you respond, this question is premature, right? It's not a good use of the time and resources. So really focus the question on that part of the first in-human part and part of your development, so you don't get an answer, this question is premature.
So that leads to a follow-up question. Both, I also see somebody posted this question in the chat box, is would you be able to give us an example or two of such questions?
Yeah, for example, if you ask about a phase 3 study design that might lead to a certain indication in the label, right? That question might be premature, for example, because you're at a pre-IND stage, but you're talking about a phase 3 study design and a label indication, which might be, depending on the speed of your development, might be too far ahead, right? Where some parts might be whether a certain clinical pharmacology program might be appropriate or not, and the preclinical data might not be there yet to make that decision, right? It depends what data you present. If you don't have in vitro data yet to inform metabolism, or if you don't have some other animal ADME data, right, that might be a premature question to make a decision whether a certain DDI study might be needed in the end, right, or whether your overall clin farm program might be appropriate. So try to think what data you have and where you are in the development program to really ask the question, would they be able to answer the question that you're asking, right? If you already think they might not be, if you yourself might not be able to answer it because you don't have the data, that's probably a premature question.
Okay. So would it be all right, for sponsors to ask a kind of a strategic question on the lines of, our intention is to demonstrate uh, safety and efficacy of this new asset for for patients, let's say a type of patients, and with a niche indication, not the general indication. Would that be a reasonable question to ask the FDA, saying this is where we're going, and would you be open to considering this type of indication?
That is a good question. So I think if I understand the question right, is asking about a patient population to be studied in phase 3,
Yeah.
right, at a pre-IND stage. I think that it might be difficult, right? Depending on the experience the agency might have in that particular disease area, right? They might be able to give you a more concrete answer. I think if it's a potential rare disease or a new indication, that might be a little bit harder if the experience is not there, right?
Yeah.
So if they've seen multiple programs, they can go, the reviewer could go back and see what have we done before. The clinicians could go back, and it might be a little easier. But if it's a novel disease area, it might be more difficult. I think whether you might get an answer that the patient population might seem appropriate, but obviously the actual indication later on might be a review issue, right? So it might be a two-part answer too. And so you might get a little bit of an indication, but you would still have to demonstrate, obviously, later on that was the right patient population.
Okay. So one of the attendees is asking you, besides time invested, is there any downside to asking clarifying questions after FDA response? So as I understand it, you submitted your meeting package and questions, and they responded, but you have follow-up questions.
I wouldn't see a downside to it, right? I would only, okay, it's 20 days. Well, you have to wait for the meeting minutes. Then you have 20 days to ask your question, and they have 20 days to respond. So worst case scenario, it might be 40 days. However, if there's a real need for clarification of that question, it might influence your decisions of doing certain studies or really understanding what FDA's needs are. I think that's a good time investment. I couldn't think of any particular downside. I mean, it's there for a reason. The reason that we had put it into PDUFA 7 was because we needed a mechanism to ask clarifying questions and have a timeline. Right? Now we actually have a timeline. Before, you might have been able to ask a question, but there was no need to respond. Now there is a clear mandate to respond to those questions. So I don't see a particular downside.
Yeah. Okay. There is a little bit of a inner layer to this question, which is, if I understand correctly, what if you had the need for clarifying, let's say 6 to 12 months down the line about some of the FDA responses? So this is past
Past,
your clarification window.
ooh, I think you could contact the project manager to ask um, and see if they are willing to entertain that. But you also have to remember that um, there is a lot of meetings at FDA, right? Um, and asking 6-12 months down the line, that meeting is not fresh in your mind anymore either from the agency. So I think it becomes more difficult to recall exactly what has been discussed at the meeting. Obviously, they have their paper trail and their reviews, right? So, but that freshness in mind is, I would think, is not there exactly anymore as it was. You know, it's like trying to write meeting minutes after 6 months when you had a meeting, right? You probably write them differently than 2 days after you had a particular meeting, right? So think about it that way. So if you ask a clarifying question 6 months afterwards, you might maybe not get the same breadth and scope of an answer, or broadness of an answer that you might get um, right after the meeting. And there is no timeline then associated with it, right? I don't know. So this is new in PDUFA 7. I don't know if they, so this formal process could probably not be used, right? Because there's certain timelines associated with it. I think you could try to contact the project manager and ask them whether they will answer or not. It's a good question.
Yeah. Yeah. My own view is that if if we miss the um, this the time period, the sweet time window when everything is fresh in folks' minds, then it most likely, if it were me, I would say that's a new
Yeah.
meeting.
I,
I mean, what type of meeting? You already exhausted your pre-IND, so it will be something else.
it also begs a little bit the question, if your strategic planning is 6 months behind, right? If you have a clarification, if you're trying to get a certain answer in that meeting and you don't utilize this, I mean, I did, it's a hypothetical situation, obviously, right? So it makes it a little bit more difficult. But if you're if you do a pre-IND meeting, it's because you want a specific answer for your development program. And if then you are 6 months behind in that program with the answer that you needed for the pre-IND, then I wonder if the question might have been the right one for that timing, right? Or if you should have asked maybe a different question to help you identify your strategy earlier on, rather than having to wait 6 months to process what was in the answer from the FDA.
Yeah. So I guess the summary is, when in doubt, just ask it.
Correct. This,
That's it.
you can, yeah, contact the project manager and ask. Yes.
The next question we have for you is, how does one prepare differently for the pre-IND meeting in case only written response meeting is granted by agency instead of face to face?
I think
You certainly don't have to press your suits and
Yeah,
get your
exactly.
ties.
You don't have to travel, right? You don't have to press a suit to, you can wear a shirt and boxer shorts over. It's not even a Zoom meeting, so it makes it easier. Now it's slightly different, right? So you have to think at a face-to-face meeting, you have the opportunity to directly interact with the review team, right? Ask some clarifying questions, have some discussion. Maybe there might be some back and forth. They can ask you for some clarification. Now, for a written response, there might be two options. One is you can request a written response. The other one is the agency might just issue a written response. They might not see the need. But the best thing is, I think, to have have a good background package to really support your position, justify your position, and support your questions, and have really clear questions that you want to get an answer for. So that this need that you try to avoid this need for going back and forth or some clarification, right? So have a I think you need a very good briefing package if you're asking for written response only. So that the reviewer can make a good assessment and try to avoid questions that would usually result in a discussion or of a face-to-face meeting, right? That would be my suggestion.
Okay. So is it fair then to say, Imo, um, always assume that it will be a written response when you uh, prepare your package and prepare for the worst?
I think that's fair to assume. I, um, I think it's fair to assume and always have a good briefing package, right? So always be prepared for the potential of getting a written response. I think that's why some of the do's and don'ts are so important, to ask the right question at the appropriate time, right? To focus on the priority of your questions, and really support your data. I cannot stress this enough, to really support your questions and support your position.
All right. Okay. So perhaps we can go back to your do's and don'ts slide in case, yeah, just to remind people if there are some specific questions. While we wait for additional questions, I have a question for us to discuss, which is um, uh, I haven't seen a TPP mentioned here. Would, would you would you see a role of TPP at this stage,
So
or and at least give a little bit background of what it is,
so
and
it's
then you can speak to
yeah.
its potential
So
role?
it's a target product profile, right? It's more an internal company document, um, of a strategy, what your the target of your product, or what your product should look like. Um, I think it goes together with the TPP and the regulatory strategy document, right? Those two would, I think, go hand in hand. Um, if you Depending on the size of your company, there might be procedures in place to obviously define the TPP at a very early stage, right? And a lot of times might be a living document, or even the regulatory strategy document, where things might change. It's good. I think it's having it for the company um, is an important part. Obviously, that's not something you provide to FDA usually, right? To the target product profile. That's more an internal document for you. But it would help for you to find the right questions, because you know where you want to go with this product. Same with the regulatory strategy document, right? Where you can ask, you can kind of you have your own strategy, and you can ask these strategic questions then in the meeting, whether certain development steps, regulatory strategy might be, you can get some indication if you ask the right question whether that strategy is adequate or not. I hope that answers your question a little bit, or did I?
Yeah. No, I just wanted to know your
Yeah.
thoughts. That's all.
No, I think it's good. Like I said, it's the first do is the regulatory research. So it defining a TPP, doing the regulatory strategy, doing your in-depth research really helps you prepare for the pre-IND meeting. Well, it helps you obviously for the drug development program, but also looking at those documents together helps you prepare for the pre-IND meeting, so you can ask the adequate question and get a response that's relevant for your development program, and that's constructive, to inform what you might want to change in your regulatory strategy, or if you might need to make changes to your TPP. Right? As you asked, for example, the patient population question might be a question, right? If the agency has a good amount of experience and might give you an answer that might not fit your TPP, then you have to do some thinking whether you still want to go in that patient population, whether you need to change your clinical strategy to go in that patient population, right? Or whether that, depending on the population, whether that's adequate even for FDA to consider. So it's a good exercise.
Okay. All right. So in your first box, for both meetings, you say regulatory intelligence research. So would you be able to articulate two or three like common questions or topics you always look for in regulatory intelligence research, um, or an example of what might constitute that kind of a assessment?
Let me try to think about a good example. For a pre-IND meeting, I think most of the time I look at how, let me start like this. Because the regulatory intelligence is based on publicly available data of approved product at FDA, right? So you can always get an idea how successful programs have looked like. That does not mean that you cannot or you shouldn't deviate from them, but it gives you an idea sometimes what the agency's thinking is about a particular question, right? And their justification for it. So if you want to go with the same approach, that might be helpful. If you want to go with a different approach, it might also be helpful to look at what the agency has thought and how they have argued. So you can try to find out what your argument needs to be and what the data might need to be to support that argument, especially if a particular question has come up multiple times in pre-IND meetings, right? Let's, some questions might be, what kind of non-clinical studies we might need to do to enable a first-in-human study, right? Then it depends then on the type of the first-in-human study. Is it a single dose? Do you want to do a dose escalation and going into multiple dose, right? So you might need a different non-clinical program maybe. So those are kind of the questions you can find in your regulatory research, by looking at pre-IND, not just, so in the approval packages, a lot of the communication is in there, but also in the end review, you can see what kind of studies have been done maybe at different stages, looking at dates. So that gives you a good idea of what the precedent what the precedent case looks like, to really give, there's so many different questions that you could ask. I'm trying to generalize it a little bit just to give an understanding of how the process works. The questions might be very different for different programs and different needs, right? But in general, I would look into what others have done in order to either have a successful program or be able to argue my point why I want to deviate from a guidance, why I want to deviate from what the agency's experience is. And whoever typed that question, if they want to ask a follow-up, if that was not enough, I'm more than happy to elaborate a little more.
No, it's helpful. Thank you very much. Um, so the this is a question, kind of based on your professional experience. Do you see, for the same pre-IND meeting, if you reflected back on how you handled it when you were at the agency versus now when you're part of a sponsor team, do you see, based on the interactions with the teams, either at the FDA or in the sponsor, the mindset, any different perspectives?
So I have to tell on myself now. No, I.
No, if you're comfortable.
No, absolutely. I mean, there is, there is a different mindset, right? I mean, and there's a different. There might be a different mission sometimes too, right? I mean, the FDA's mission is to protect and promote public health. We all, and as a sponsor, we obviously want to get treatments to patients who need them, to make them accessible and get them there fast, right? So there's a balance between, the service mission of the agency and the need for the sponsor to provide medicines as quickly as possible. And sometimes there's differences in scientific opinion too, in the science world, which is one of the fundamentals, right? To question your assumptions. I think that it's slightly a different mindset of what you're looking at, right? As a reviewer, you try to assess a meeting package from a different perspective, right? Yeah, at first you get a limited amount of data, right? So when you have I don't know, 200, 300 page briefing package, right? Or it depends on the meeting. That's a pre-digested, pre-formulated package that the reviewer gets versus the data that you see in the company, right? So you have to make decisions with a much more limited data set and trying to find how that fits into precedent cases, the regulatory experience, other cases you have at the agency, right? Trying to align that to that no program gets a favorable or different treatment, right? So there's a slew of other questions that you ask internally, than or the perspective that you have as a sponsor. And I mean, you don't want to tell one program you don't need to do this, and another similar program or almost the same program to tell, well, you do have to do this, right? So there's a lot of different considerations that go into this from a reviewer's perspective.
Okay, we have a question from the audience. For a rare disease, um, we developed, that sponsor, multiple models. I'm assuming those are animal models and assays for the disease for proof of concept and safety. A plan for CMC and biomarker studies in humans. Okay, so they have prepared a plan for that. Is this an appropriate stage for interact meeting prior to IND enabling studies in GLP GMP compliant settings?
Um, if I remember right, interact meetings are about proof of concept studies, right? So I think you should have some.
You can go back to your
Yeah.
previous slide maybe to remind.
So here, no, it's really early development. If you have multiple models, I think that might be a good stage to have an interact meeting, right? You have some proof of concept studies, or you have a novel challenge, you have different animal models, and you want to see which one might be, if I understand it right, which one might be the right animal model to inform, your early development program and then first in human studies. So I would think that an interact meeting would be a good idea, right? Because you get some early feedback on what FDA's thoughts about the different animal models are, um, which one might be an appropriate one, right? What the data shows, and have some discussion with them, and you get an outside perspective, right? So I would think, without having seen the data, just with as a reviewer, just with a limited amount of information in that question, but I think that might be definitely worth a consideration.
Okay. But wouldn't you think that are you thinking interact would be appropriate because it's a rare disease?
You see, I don't think it. So for interact, it doesn't matter if it's a rare disease or not a rare disease, right? It's just an early,
Yeah.
a very early interaction. So.
Yeah. But it says unique challenges in early development.
Correct, right? It does, whether it's a rare disease or non-rare disease, it depends on really unique novel challenges. If you haven't,
Yeah.
if you're developing animal model and you need some feedback of which one might be appropriate one, then an interact meeting might be a good pathway for that. If you're trying, there's also, if you're trying to do it for a disease independent of a product, right? So if it's a disease model potentially, there's also the critical path innovation meetings, right? That are product agnostic, where you can have some discussions with the agency about novel approaches, or for example, novel animal model for disease type that might be, or that should be or are product agnostic, right? So you wouldn't discuss a product, but just a general model type. So there's,
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. It makes sense. All right. So we have a poll posted. I hope you are all able to um, see it. If you can take few minutes before we wrap this session to respond to that poll, it will take you literally 2 seconds or 3 seconds. That would be great. If you don't see the poll, let me know and we'll make sure you have access to it. While the poll is going on, did you have any closing comments, Imo?
Yes, I just wanted to mention it's a very valuable, both the Interact and the Pre-IND meeting, I think are very valuable strategic meetings, right? It's again, I cannot stress this enough. It's an opportunity to get early interaction with the agency, to get early feedback from the agency, and it helps you plan, right? So I know there is some timelines involved and it might take some time, but those are minuscule compared to the time you might lose if your development program might not fit the agency's expectations later on, right? Or if you're put on a clinical hold potentially, right, and in your first in human study, which might also result in other, if you have to disclose it publicly. So I think there's a real advantage to utilizing these meetings.
All right. On that note, I wanted to thank you very much for taking time to share your thoughts and experience with us and with the audience. Again, these slides are outstanding. They 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 can help other regulatory professionals and drug developers um, a great deal in terms of when they're thinking through interact or pre-IND. So thank you very much for taking time, and until next time,
Thank you
take
very
care.
much, and thank you everybody for the questions in the chat.